Martin Amis. When you hear that name, it immediately conjures up these images of razor-sharp wit, a bit of literary controversy, and just this brilliant, sometimes brutal dissection of modern life. He was a writer who really held up a mirror to our times, and he wasn't afraid to show us all the absurdities and anxieties reflected back. So let's dive in and unpack the work of this literary giant. And this quote, well, it absolutely nails it. Amis is defined by his provocative style and exploration of contemporary society. That's the heart of everything he did. See, he wasn't just telling stories. Oh no, he was more like a doctor, diagnosing the condition of the world around him. And his incredibly sharp satirical prose, well, that was his scalpel. All right, so here's our roadmap. We're going to start with what made him the voice of an era. Then we'll get into his explosive early novels, his legendary critique of the 1980s, and then his later shift into much darker, more historical stuff. And we'll wrap it all up by looking at his lasting legacy. So, what was it that made Martin Amis the voice of his era? I mean, how did he become this absolute master of modern satire? Well, the answer really lies in his obsessive focus on the things that kept people up at night. Okay, so look at these themes. What's so fascinating is how they're all tangled up together. Amis was just obsessed with the modern self. How do you even form an identity when you're constantly bombarded by pop culture? And what on earth happens to morality in a world of just non-stop consumerism? He saw things like ambition and rivalry not just as personal quirks, but as symptoms of a society that was kind of losing its way. And he captured it all with this incredible style, blending this high-minded, beautiful prose with the gritty, messy language of the street. Right, onto his early work in the 1970s. You've got to understand, Amis didn't just quietly ease into the literary scene. No, he burst onto it, basically kicking the door down and immediately establishing himself as this challenging, totally unignorable new voice. And this slide just illustrates his range perfectly right from the get-go. His first novel, The Racial Papers, is this incredibly sharp, funny, and intense dive into the mind of a young guy, Charles Highway, who's wrestling with desire and who he is. But then, just 2 years later, bam, Dead Babies goes wide, exploring this huge societal decay. It's bleak, it's nihilistic, it's fueled by this pitch-black humor about a generation just spiraling into chaos. He goes from the deeply personal to the massively societal in a heartbeat. Which brings us to the 80s. The decade of excess. It was pretty much the perfect canvas for Amis to paint what many, many people consider his absolute masterpieces. And right at the center of it all is one of modern literature's greatest, most grotesque anti-heroes, John Self. He's the main character in Money, a filmmaker just driven by pure hedonism. We're talking fast food, booze, pornography, and, of course, money. He is a walking, talking embodiment of appetite, completely unchecked. Just a brilliantly repulsive character you can't look away from. So here's the key thing to get. John Self isn't just a character, he is the 1980s. Through his absolutely wild journey through the sleaziest parts of London and New York, Amis puts the greed and the moral rot of extreme consumer culture right under the microscope. The whole thing is narrated in this virtuosic mashup of advertising slang and intellectual despair. It's just a darkly hilarious and totally scathing takedown of an era defined by having way, way too much. But Amis didn't just stay in one place. In the second half of his career, you see this really significant shift. He starts moving away from contemporary satire to tackle these enormous, heavy historical subjects and ask some really profound questions about humanity itself. This timeline really lays it all out, doesn't it? The 70s are all about that youthful crisis. The 80s, that's greed. In the 90s, with a book like The Information, he turned that satirical eye inward, looking at the world of literary jealousy. And then, from the 2000s on, you see this dramatic pivot to grapple with these huge historical forces like Stalin's Russia and the Holocaust. And this leads us to a really, really difficult question, one that Amis decided to confront head-on in his later work. How can fiction even begin to touch the banality of evil? You know, that chilling idea that horrific, monstrous acts are often committed by people who seem totally ordinary. Well, he tackles that question directly in his provocative 2014 novel, The Zone of Interest. By telling the story from the perspective of an Auschwitz camp commandant, Amis forces you, the reader, to confront the moral gymnastics and the sheer indifference that can exist right in the face of absolute atrocity. It is a daring, deeply unsettling look into the darkest corners of humanity. So, finally, what is the Amos legacy? What's the lasting impression he's left on the literary world? When you boil it all down, his impact is just clear and undeniable. He was a defining voice for his generation, a true master of satire whose witty, electric prose style really pushed the boundaries of what a novel could be. His style was built on these shocking sentences and unforgettable, often monstrous characters. And maybe, just maybe, the most important thing is that he was completely fearless, totally willing to take on the most complex and uncomfortable subjects of our time. And that really brings us to our final thought. I mean, the world that Amos was writing about, with all its excesses, its moral vacuums, its cultural noise, it hasn't gone away, has it? If anything, it's only gotten more intense. So the real question for us today is this. In our age of social media and hyper-consumerism, are Martin Amos's searing critiques more essential, more relevant now than they ever were?